expected a lot of hands to go up immediately. Lots of information to think over. Right here, Abby.
Hi, my name is Abby, and I have a question for Dr. Smith about saying that gerrymandering does not lead to partisan polarization. And you did talk about the fact that they didn't really look at primaries. And my concern is that the challenges in the primary now, and it's not so much that everybody, the seats are safe for Republicans or Democrats, but that they become more and more extreme, and that's why, and the moderates have no voice in the legislature anymore, and so nobody's hearing that, and that's why there's no independence in the middle anymore in your little map of. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Okay, so that's there's a couple things in there. One is the question of whether there's moderates. So parties may not be in your hearts, but they are in your minds. You can't get them out, unfortunately. But regards to the primaries, I think one issue is that people don't choose to participate in primaries. If you are in a gerrymandered district, you should vote in the party primary of the party that's in control. So there are some concerns there. So you talk about extremism. Well, the question is, we're allowed to participate in those party primaries. If those voters really did care and didn't like it, why don't they participate in that process? I would agree that there's not much. It becomes a lot harder. Difficult time. It's just people don't pay attention to those. But in terms of polarization itself, gerrymandering again is it's not sort of a strong connection. There's a lot of other factors at play. So I defer to that.
That's it. All right, this person right here.
I'm Penny Gardner, and I am a voter, not politician, volunteer. And when I was looking at the commission and the minority was taken into account, what are the minorities that will be taken into account? I'm a lesbian. I'm wondering about economic equality, certainly the racial and religion and all that other stuff. But I think there's so many minorities that it's going to be difficult. But I think that it's also crucial to take the energy to do that. And I don't know who can answer it. Maybe
I think everyone can.
So in terms of the Voting Rights Act, and it comes from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So any class that is protected in that law is up for grabs, right? So primarily in the state of Michigan, it's been used to make sure that we don't disenfranchise African Americans, but there's other protected classes that are within that law. I also think that this is another opportunity for the communities of interest to make much more sense, right? If there is a religious group or sort of school board or a school district, for example, that might be divided by lines, they can make an argument that they are a community of interest that should be together, right? So at the individual level, I'm not really sure how sexual affiliation or sexual affinity would go into that community of interest bucket, but I think that it's completely possible, and it's certainly something that this current policy the current process doesn't allow for, but this one would.
I just want to say I'm not sure that sexuality or LGBTQMRA
I know.
is in the state thing. Yeah. And I also want to just add that Lansing has one of the biggest communities of lesbians in the country.
I think you should make an argument for that then, yes.
Thank you. That's interesting that school districts have been split before.
I knew
that. That's the point that important.
My name is Patrick Rose, and I had a question for my good friend Richard McClellan. I wondered what principled objection you might have to the nonpartisan features of the citizen-led redistricting commissions in the Republican-led states that have adopted them, like Alaska and Arizona, such as taking it out of the secret back door kind of deliberations, the lack of transparency, the lack of public inputs. And I know that President George H.W. Bush, President Reagan, Arnold Schwarzenegger, a whole lot of Republicans in Maryland and Illinois really love fixing those parts. And I wondered what your core value objections are to fixing those parts. And the reason I asked that, and this is my basic anecdote, Jocelyn Benson got 240 groups of 3 or 4 college students and retired people and high school students to draw maps in 2010. The best maps that were voted on using a process very similar to what's in this policy was from the Republican student chapter president and his team at Central Michigan, and they walked those maps to the legislature here, and they presented them to the leaders of the House and Senate. And what we got instead was a map that was done in secret, and so you've got the two processes in parallel, and you can actually run the numbers. I'm wondering, on the process side of things, what's your core value objection to these Republican-favored other features that citizen-led commissions have?
Okay, thank you.
Well, there was a lot there. I'm not sure exactly what you were asking, but you obviously don't. My personal view, I'm not a Republican or I'm not a Democrat. I'm retired, so I'm kind of. I think I could apply as a nonpartisan person for the commission. I am not opposed. I'd like to have something that is more, leads to compact districts, protect existing political boundary lines, because I think that's better for the people to be represented in those kinds of districts where their existing communities, geographic communities, are represented. I have personally a lot of questions about the idea of a unelected commission deciding who are the communities of interest that will be valued in our state. It just sort of makes me crawl. It could be, Tea Party members or, as you said, LGBT groups, whatever. But I'm just old-fashioned. I like clear rules, and I don't know. Patrick, what you don't like, well, number one, you don't know what I believe in, but I have core values of believing the political system, the democratic political system, has been a pretty good one, although we keep trying to improve it. And I tend to be in favor of not rewriting the rules every time, to help whoever wants to get ahead. That's just my own personal view. I don't think it makes any difference what I think. It made a difference by a large number of people that petitioned and got it on the ballot. And I give them credit for it. It's almost impossible to get a thing on the ballot with volunteers. And they've done it. And now that group will face the special interests, of which I'm a proud member, to try to defeat it.
I think we all have our special interests, right? But,
Do you represent?
Republican. And Dr. Jean Dawes, she thinks I'm a closet progressive.
Thank you, Richard. Davia would like to.
So I just want to make a point of correction on the statement that you made about communities of interest. I want you to understand that what we mean by communities of interest is that the commissioners would hear from Michigan citizens about what their communities of interest are. They don't come with preconceived notions of what constitutes a community of interest. So I just want to make sure I clarify that.
I understand there's a concern about, just like we have a citizen legislature, right? That's the purpose of term limits. So we would have a citizen commission, and it sounds like there's some concern about that. Obviously, we're looking at the process today. What's the process for redistricting or for drawing those lines? And so if you look at the process, rules are necessary, right? Rules are necessary. And we do this every 10 years for a reason. Things change. People move, district shifts, the population of districts shift. So I think it's a pretty good idea to do this every 10 years. Would you agree?
This force, absolutely.
Redistricting.
I would say that we are limited by census data, and a lot of these communities of interest are not. When I define religion, for instance, or sexual orientation, affinity, those are not included. So I don't even know how you count that.
Well, it's important for the testimony. So one of the things that they do in California as well as Arizona and Alaska that use independent commissions is they seek testimony. They seek public input on what constitutes their community of interest. And so this is unusual for Michiganders because we don't actually use this process right now. So it would simply be where the commissioners would be holding meetings across the state and saying, if you have a community of interest that you would like to be considered, it has to be based in geography, right? So Lansing would make a perfect sense for the example that you used there. You can say, I live in Lansing. We happen to be one of the biggest communities of this particular group. We would like to have consideration when you think about drawing those maps. I think it's really just data collection. And it really comes from people participating in the process and saying, yes, we have a religious community here that's currently split up between 5 different house districts. We all live in the same 20-mile radius. Can you not consider that when you're thinking about those house lines or those Senate lines? And I think that's really the difference, that we just don't know it here because we don't do it here. But other states have done it, and they've done it very well.
There's a question over here. Oh, Abby, you, and then you.
Hi, my name's Tony Daunt, and I'm a committed partisan and conservative. And I've got a question, maybe 2 parts. Forgive me if I don't necessarily buy into this idea that this is an independent group made up of leaders who have given strictly to Democrat causes over the years. But secondarily, we hear these talks about doing this out in public, and we want to get this out of the back doors. And in 2010, California passed a similar initiative. And in 2011, ProPublica, which is no right-wing outlet in terms of the work that they do, gave a pretty lengthy and devastating critique of how the California Democrats basically used it to their advantage and rolled the tables and ran over this so-called independent commission. So for people like myself, this is kind of what Richard said. It's just a front group for those on the left who aren't getting the way now as the rules are currently written. And how would Davia in particular respond to this concern that people have that you're just rewriting the rules to make it sound better, but really all you're doing is looking to put an imprimatur of independent on left-wing activism?
Yeah, so I would actually point out what Corey was talking about, like where the Republican advantage in the state of Michigan is actually fairly weak, and that it really is a turnout question. And so when you have districts that might be drawn in a way that they currently are, that might move certain aspects of voters into different districts, it actually reduces the ability of that change to happen. So I would say that any process that allows for people to testify and sort of provide data to the commission is better than what we currently have. It's different than providing testimony in front of a congressional committee. Secondly, on the other point about like being a front group for some Democrats, I mean, if you look at our campaign finance reports, you would see that that's not true. And secondly, in terms of our own partisan leanings, I think that this policy really does speak to the principles of fairness and transparency. And I would really just say that if there's states like Maryland that are heavily gerrymandered towards Democrats, or states like Illinois that are heavily slanted towards Democrats, and you have a lot of Republican leaders in Washington and beyond that have said that this is a process that should be changed. I think that really should resonate with more people on the right without looking at the individuals and how they may be feeling about the current state of the elections. We know by looking at the maps that has happened over time. So as long as I've been in the state, I've gone through 2 redistricting cycles, and the changes, it has been fairly dramatic. And so I think that making a process where it takes that out of someone's hands, that might have a reason to gain the table, is better for all of us.
I was wondering if you could, further clarify and perhaps debate the issue over a partisan versus a nonpartisan activity. What we heard was the VNP basically say that they're striving for an independent committee to take as much of the partisanship out of it, so it's a nonpartisan activity. And yet we heard Mr. McClendon say there's no such thing as a nonpartisan redistricting activity. So I was wondering if you could just further debate that and clarify those issues. Thank you.
I've been at this business for 50 years, and my experience is that almost every voter, especially those who take the time to show up at a meeting or something like that, even though they say they're nonpartisan, they have partisan instincts. And this kind of process that is going to use a Rube Goldberg type selection process for these commissioners to then work for a whole year, I personally believe it will be captured there'll be efforts by both political parties to capture it. With the data, with the kinds of efforts that they have to do, and lining up the so-called communities of interest to testify. If you look over across the street in the Capitol, there are literally thousands of communities of interest that I think are represented here every year. The Boy Scouts of America, the Girl Scouts, every kind of citizen group out there generally has somebody representing them. You got the ACLU, you got the League of Women Voters, and then there's all the right-wing Republican groups. So almost everybody is represented, and this proposal basically says none of those people count. We raise a more the more important people are people who have no track record, have no fingerprints on the political system. I just think that's wrong, and I don't think there's such a thing. If you work for a year and a half on this commission, if you weren't political to begin with, you will by the end of it. And that's just my own sense.
So I think that's actually true, but that's actually the beauty of the design of the policy, right? So on the first point is that the commissioners would be randomly selected every 10 years. So the likelihood that there would be someone, now I know that there's some probabilities, statistician sitting over here. So the probability that a commissioner would actually serve in 1 year and then serve again a decade later is fairly low. I think the other ways that we sort of safeguard this process is by requiring that the maps themselves at the end are tested to make sure that disfavor and favoring of a candidate or a party is not included in the maps that are submitted. I think the other thing that I would say probably in response to that question is also the fact that we require agreement amongst all of the different buckets, right? That actually will require a lot of deliberation. So yes, by the end of this process, I believe commissioners probably will be fairly political. They will hear from all 6 or 7 million Michigan citizens about the things that are important to them. But I think that the likelihood that they serve again, number one, is fairly low. We also make sure that they have they are newbies for a reason. We want them to learn in this process what Michigan should look like, and we want them to learn it by asking citizens rather than coming with their preconceived notions of what that should be. And then I think that the agreement component that is part of the commissioner's decision process makes it also very powerful, that we require it not to be just one party or one group on the commission that is making the decision in terms of the maps.
I wanted to comment on that just for a minute. If I understand it, somehow after it's all done, somebody can come in, some other body can review whether it favors or disfavors a particular candidate. I got to really read this a lot more carefully, but I can tell you that's what they do with the lines to favor disfavor candidates. 30 years ago, Congressman Bob Carr was a Democrat congressman. He called me and he said, I need you to represent me in the reapportionment fight. I said, no, I'm a Republican. He said, no, I don't need you to do anything against the Republicans. I need to move the line to screw Howard Wolpe, who was a fellow congressman. And we prevailed. And Wolpe was driven out of the Congress, ran for governor. And that was absolutely to help a Democrat defeat another Democrat.
I think Corey can actually speak to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, homage is a prime target this next cycle. But Representative Amash is a prime target for that sort of action this time around. To me, I guess I'm a little unclear about how, because technically parties have the right to exclude people. That's a right in the Bill of Rights. The parties have the right to exclude people. So I think one question is who defines whether someone's a partisan, the person themselves or the party? And the Supreme Court is pretty clear that the party does. So there's that issue. So, I mean, I don't want to comment on the policy specifically. I would say that the idea of transparency, while sounding good, is also very much correlated with everything we've seen in the last 20 years that has led to more openness. And that is correlated with, now I don't want to say causally, but it is correlated with polarization. That is, the more open we've made things, namely, we don't like the sausage, so we want pure, more pure things, and that includes ideology. And so that is, in some cases, while transparency is, from a procedural justice standpoint, something people treasure in terms of the process, it's not necessarily true that they like the outcome.
We are running short on time. I'm going to take a couple more questions, but we need to keep it short. Okay. Abby?
Just a quick comment, the objection that you had to this whole newbie situation, this is exactly what we do with courts, sitting on a jury. You get people by random, you get them to sit on a jury, you can kick them off, each lawyer can kick them off, and we trust average citizens to make decisions on court cases every day, and it works. So I understand what you're saying, but I think that it is a real shining light of our democracy that we can do that with ordinary citizens. And I think this would do the same thing.
My question is very simple. Why don't you let the voters make those decisions as to who gets to run and who doesn't? Why don't you let the voters make the decisions as to who gets to run and who doesn't?
And I promised one more.
Just a question for Richard. A question for Richard. Could you provide some transparency on what groups and political persuasions are going to provide funding for this ballot initiative, and what their end game is? My hypothesis is they'd like to turn the state legislature into a legislature like exists in Illinois or California, and ultimately an economic decline and more dependency. Comments?
3 questions. One.
Yeah, I think that question was actually directed towards me. So the funding of the campaign is, right now, we actually have the most grassroots donations and the highest number of grassroots donations as a ballot committee that any of the other ballot committees that are out there in the state of Michigan right now. So in terms of big money, it's not there. Continue to look at our campaign finance for that, but it's not there. The second question about what will be the result for the legislature The answer to that is we don't know. We don't know what candidates will be running. We don't know what the parties will be doing. What we really are concerned about is the actual process by which we draw the maps. So the result, which I think Corey also talked about as well, is that people get angry at two things, right? Either the process or the result. We make no promises about what the result of the maps that might be drawn by the commission is going to be. We make every promise about what the process of that drawing will be. That is exactly, that's the simplest way to answer that question.
So, we have given you a lot to think about. And one of the things I want you to think about is completing the evaluation. One of the questions on there is, did you learn anything new today? Did you meet anyone you didn't know before you came here today? And I'm anxious to see the responses to that. You know, really, you the people, you the audience will make some decisions on the question of the day. And we hope that we've given you some understanding of the process, the current process, what other states are doing, what some of the proposals are for a future process. So we've given you something to think about, some information to carry outside of this room. The conversation's not over, and I'm sure it will keep going and going and going. We'll see what happens. You decide. You'll be the decider on how the process moves. Our next forum is February the 7th, and it's going to be on broadband access. So I think that's going to be quite a good conversation to have here in this room. So finally, could you help me in thanking our panelists? Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you next month, February 7th.